Hi friends, my name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. So I had a little bit of trouble connecting this morning. Normally I do these live stream reels on Facebook, but there's been some schedule issues when live streams happen on that page in the evening, so I sort of thought I would start doing some live streams here while there's that bit of a clash. So anyway, today I wanted to, you've noticed that the last few days I've been talking about Yemen, and I'm going to include Yemen in this talk because there's a genocide happening there right now, fully backed by the US, and it was started during the Obama administration, and it's been going now for 3 years. Approximately 3 years, and so that's something that we have to pay attention to and call out for the end of, because it's happening right now. But what I was going to talk about this morning particularly was we often sort of, as humans, we tend to always blame somebody externally for what's happening, and it's just something that we do. Whether it's when it's brought to our attention that there's lots of animals being killed, being treated cruelly or whatever on farms, instead of looking to ourselves as that we're the reason why these animals are on the farms because we're not vegan. Instead, we sort of will look for all kinds of external, things to blame, like corporations and businesses and the farms that breed these animals into existence for us to use as resources. And that's just something that we tend to do. We don't like to think that we might be the cause of their suffering, and that it's actually in our hands. This suffering is in our hands. The suffering and killing of these animals is in our hands because we're the ones that create the demand for those animal products. They wouldn't be there if we didn't create demand. And that's just one example of how we tend to always look outwardly, blaming others and and large entities for what's going on. We even do that, we do that in all sorts of ways. Like, for example, what's happening in Yemen. We can say, well, isn't it awful that this government, the United States government, which is fully backing this genocide in Yemen that's happening right now, aren't they awful? But the fact is that if we're a United States citizen, we've put those people into power. We voted them in, and we've continued to vote these kinds of people into power over many, many decades or even hundreds of years. And we, instead of, when things start to go awry, which they started, the military-industrial complex, Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex back in the 50s, saying that that they would, it was dangerous, and that we shouldn't let it get out of control. Well, we have let it get out of control if we're a United States citizen. And now, they've been running the show for a very long time, including the CIA, overthrowing governments left and right, democratically elected governments. 81, in fact, between 1946 to 2000. They've attempted to or have successfully overthrown democratically elected governments, most of them, during that time, and it goes on unabated. My country included. They admitted they overthrew the Gough Whitlam government in 1975. That was a democratic socialist prime minister. But what I'm trying to say is that we've allowed this to happen. We've allowed these we've allowed these things to happen over time. It just didn't suddenly happen. For example, Donald Trump didn't suddenly happen. This has been leading up to and assisting to this point where now, and Obama put in all sorts of, sort of gave him all sorts of abilities to do what he's doing now, dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency and basically giving corporations a free-for-all with non-human animal habitats. And of course, that's because most of us aren't vegan, and we see them as sort of secondary to what we do. But I mean, this is all sort of a result of our lack of inaction, and also a combination of being non-vegan, a combination of buying into tribalism and thinking that our little area is the most important thing, and not thinking in terms of a global community. And neoliberalism is set in, and that's the other thing. It's the corporations have been taking over. We have in the United States an inverted totalitarian state now, where the marketplace is, instead of a demagogue, you have a corporation-run sort of society, basically. And you can look that up. Sheldon Wallen, who died about a year ago, he wrote a book. I think it's called Democracy Incorporated. So that's a very interesting one about inverted totalitarianism. But since, it's our lack of inaction. Instead of, we think in terms of our family. Some people, this is something that's promoted in the media. Family is the most important thing. Or as over time, it's become the individual is the most important thing. That has gotten us this idea of, individuals being the most important thing, has gotten us into this mess we're in now, where we don't see other people. We don't see people in other countries, for example, Yemen or the Palestinians. We don't see them as our brothers and sisters, as a global community. Instead, we are caught up in a sort of patriotism or tribalism, or just being interested in ourselves and how the world, what we can get, this sort of selfish sort of thing, what we can get for ourselves as individuals. And neoliberalism has fed into that, because neoliberalism and capitalism has fed into that by, buy this, buy that, this will make you feel better, that will make you feel better. Doesn't matter about what that does to the planet or what that does to other people in other countries with slave labor and all sorts of things. Buy it, buy it, buy it. And that has made us, that has fed into our selfishness. And I sometimes think, like I was listening to Abby Martin, the journalist Abby Martin, who's an amazing journalist. She does the Empire Files program. I mention her often because I think she's one of the most important journalists around today in relation to exposing the crimes of empire, and hopefully to get us to wake up that U.S. empire is the greatest threat to world peace, and that it needs to come to an end. It needs to be dismantled, basically, and a lot of these problems will end. So she's a very important journalist, and there's a few others that I can mention too. But she was talking last night on her Media Roots podcast, and I encourage you to subscribe to that, Media Roots Radio. You can find it on SoundCloud, and I'll leave a link to that. And last night she was talking in their last, Robbie Martin and Abby Martin, in their podcast recently, they were talking about how there's about 500 Palestinians in the recent Great March of Return were shot in the head. Not all of them died, but they were shot in the head by snipers during the Great March of Return, which was a peaceful protest. They were unarmed. So that's, they're intentionally trying to kill, assassinate unarmed Palestinians. And she started crying during that podcast. And that's the sort of person she is. She's doing her journalism because she sees everything as the global community, that all these people we're all related. I mean, we literally are all related, and I go further than that. And non-human animals and human animals, we are a global community. That's why I'm vegan. I don't want to be exploiting and oppressing non-human animals. That's why I'm vegan. I don't eat, wear, and use animal products to the best of my ability, even though animal products are in chairs and computers and phones and all sorts of things. I don't eat dairy, eggs, flesh. I don't wear wool, leather, fur, etc. I don't want to use sentient animals as resources. So I take that global community in a larger sense. And I don't know where Abby is on that, but anyway, I'm just throwing that in there because veganism is a very important thing to me, and it should be a very important thing to everybody who's into nonviolence and justice. But anyway, so Abby was talking about, she started crying because she was very, very moved. She cares about the Palestinians. She cares about the vulnerable, about disenfranchised groups. And just before that, she was talking about, and she said, the Palestinians often ask, does the outside care about us? People in Gaza, there's a blockade and they can't really go anywhere. And they ask, does the outside world care about us? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? It's a good question too, that the people in Yemen, the children that are dying at a rate of one child every 10 minutes because of famine and disease, and this is caused directly by US empire and Saudi Arabia bombing them and in an intentional genocide, which is not being it's not being given any airing really in the mainstream media. And what are Congress members doing? But the question is, do we care? I have to ask this question, I find it very disturbing. I find it very disturbing living in a world where people are not called, like, for one thing, I know that there are people who are who only follow mainstream news, and it's very difficult to find independent journalism, but it is possible. And so they just follow mainstream news, and they follow something that feeds into, to a degree, to some people's discriminations. It feeds into the racism and the xenophobia, which is intentional. And it feeds into the otherization of that group to the point where we don't see them as human. And that's been done to the Palestinians. And that's one of the reasons why they've been almost completely abandoned by the West. Because they've been vilified to the extent that people don't see them as human. And within Israel, the apartheid state of Israel, they're not seen as human. Most people, I'm not saying everybody in Israel thinks that, the apartheid state of Israel, but xenophobia and racism is so extreme now. It's literally genocidal racism. They openly call for the killing of Palestinians. They want them gone, dead, exterminated. And I use that word exterminated. It's sort of Nazi-esque what they're doing to Palestinians. But I'm trying to say that I'm finding it almost untenable mentally, psychologically, to live in a world where, like I started this talk saying, we're responsible in many ways for what's going on because we haven't spoken out and to a degree we've been kept in the dark. I have in my own country. You never hear anything, any real information about what's been happening for decades to the Palestinians. You just don't. I haven't. Anybody in the Middle East, in my country, in Australia, has been sort of, any time you ever saw any images about the Middle East on TV, and that includes the public broadcaster, the ABC, I'd say 98% of the information that we would get in Australia, and I'm sort of in 58, so I've, this has been going on. I've seen this sort of presentation of Middle Eastern people, which is very distorted. So since the 60s, it's been going on as long as I've been alive, and people, what you see is images of people on the backs of cars waving rifles in the air. It's Middle Eastern people, and I should use Western Asian because Middle Eastern is sort of a colonialist word, but people in the Middle East, I'll use that just for the sake of, what we're used to hearing, are often presented in that way of violent. They're presented as violent people who are chaotic and who just want more violence. That's how people in the Middle East have been presented to me as a citizen of Australia by the mainstream media my entire life, almost 6 decades now. And that can't help, that propaganda, completely dangerous propaganda, can't help but have an effect on people, except that because the West is, there's this white supremacist thing in the West, where because we're white, we think that, there's this underlying attitude that we think we're superior, and that there's that these other countries they need our help. It's that sort of white man's burden kind of thing. The white man's burden, the British going in and helping, here and there, helping these poor brown and black people, that kind of attitude. That still runs in the West on some level, on a DNA almost, this white supremacist attitude. And we in the West, white people, on the whole, not everybody, but seem to, and that's why, one of the reasons why a lot of people in the West are quite happy to let these things go on and on and on. The things that are happening in Yemen, the things that are happening in Palestine, they're happening to other. They're happening to other. These less than human people. These people who like violence, that they don't know anything else but how to be violent, that sort of thing. That there's this, that's sort of an underlying attitude, and that we in the West benefit from the imperialist wars and everything. We in the West benefit from that. We benefit from their resources, and we benefit from the managed chaos that the US empire does. I mean, right now, my government, the Australian government, I'm not aware that they've said anything about the genocide led by the Saudis, but fully backed and participated in by the US. They haven't said anything about that as far as I'm aware. And I don't think you see it on television, and if it is presented on mainstream media, it's presented in a distorted way. It's not putting full responsibility on the US and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And I think the UK is even involved in there somewhere. They sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. So does Canada. That's the thing. Everybody is profiting from this genocide in Yemen, The UK, I think Saudi Arabia is its biggest buyer of weapons. The Canadian government, Trudeau, who everybody thinks is just fabulous, he sold a whole lot of tanks, I think, or something. He's sold a whole lot of armory to Saudi Arabia. You know? And so the West is profiting from the destruction of every single country in the Middle East. And you know, the US empire wants to overthrow the government, the socialist government in Venezuela, because there's lots of oil there. So they do their darndest to meddle in Latin American countries, funding the opposition like they do in Venezuela, and you get the full backing of the mainstream media about that. You know, this is why, you know, this US empire has to come to an end, because it's literally the greatest threat to world peace today. But what I'm trying to say is that the reason, you know, this has come to this head, the reason we're on the brink of extinction is because we've been totally caught up in our own, we haven't seen ourselves as a global community. We've allowed these artificial borders, you know, these artificial borders of countries, you know, these countries that we've artificially called Australia and, you know, USA and all of this. We've allowed our little tribalist things, our tribalism and our, you know, self-involvement, and by this, by that, to bring us now to the point of extinction of our species, taking most species with us. And the planet will go on without us, and we're just a blink of an eye in our appearance on this planet, you know, in relation to how long this planet has been here. Oh, I've got a little friend in the back. Excuse that little collar that she's wearing, that's actually a bird deflector. When I let her outside, I go outside and she has a little collar on to alert birds. Anyway, so that's Alia. Anyway, my point is that we're really we've allowed this to happen, each one of us, if we haven't been paying attention. You know, we haven't been paying attention, and now all those that haven't been paying attention and who have been benefiting from this, from this US imperialism in the Middle East, are now sort of, they're being affected too. White people are being affected too. But what my point, the main thing I wanted to say is how psychologically distressing it is for me and for others who do see things in terms of global community. And how can you not, with the internet and everything that has sort of made us aware of everything a lot more than what we normally would be aware of, that it's almost psychologically untenable to be living in a where genocides now are just allowed to go by the US government and Saudi Arabia, and with the full support of the mainstream media. And it's just going on right now as we speak. And what can you do about it? Excuse me. And if everybody on the planet who knew about this, for example, everybody on the pages that I do live streams on, each rose up and were extremely vocal. I'm not into violence, so I'm talking about a non-violent response. If we all spoke out, these small group of warmongering neoliberal neocons that are running the show now, and the corporations that are throwing the money to run the show, they wouldn't be able to get away with this. If we were all speaking out against this, you know, it wouldn't be able to go on and on and on. If everybody was saying, this is outrageous, what's happening in Yemen. You know, if we were saying, this is outrageous, it's outrageous what's happening in Yemen right now. 1 child every 10 minutes is dying from disease and famine. And it's all our fault. It's all our fault. The US government and Saudi Arabia are committing a genocide right now in Yemen, right now. And what are we doing about it? I find this extremely disturbing. Don't you? Children. Extremely disturbing. And what's happening to Palestinians? Palestinians have been all but abandoned. They've been all but abandoned. And they're being shot like animals, in quotes, in Gaza, for simply wanting to be free and to be able to live like other people. Shot at a fence of an open-air prison. In the heads, 500. And children being shot, and people with no legs in wheelchairs being killed, and medics being killed. Raza al-Najir running away with her hands in the air. She was a medic, 21. Shot in the back, through the heart, came out through the heart. And all she was doing was trying to treat the injured, and there were thousands, there was over 10,000 injured in that great March of Return. Simply that all they were doing was wanting to be free and to be able to live like other people in that awful apartheid state of Israel. I mean, what kind of fucked up world is this? You know, what kind of fucked up world is this? I'm sorry to swear, but so I'm finding, you know, this lack of response. I know things are changing a bit for Palestinians because people have suddenly, I don't know what's taken them so long, but they've suddenly woken up that something is very wrong. It's taken people being murdered, you know, in a march, unarmed, by snipers in Gaza, for people to wake up. Some people, anyway. So anyway, the thing is, though, if everybody spoke out about this, this probably wouldn't be able to go on. Excuse me. If we were, you know, it's like when I like I said in the beginning, when I talk about the animals being tortured and killed by, you know, the hundreds of billions every year for, you know, mostly mostly, sort of palate pleasure, really, because we don't need animal products at all to survive. And, we can easily meet our nutrition requirements from plants and other animal sources. And people wring their hands and go, oh, isn't that awful? That's so wrong what they're doing on that farm, to those animals. And yet they're sitting there eating a burger while they're wringing their hands about it. It's this whole thing of it's out there. And some people respond to this genocide in Yemen by putting a sad little emoticon on a post. What kind of a response is that? I mean, if this was happening to the United States, right? If this was happening to the United States, what's happening in Yemen or what's happening for Palestinians, I would hope, and I'm sure, there would be worldwide outrage, wouldn't there? There would be people all over the world, in Western countries, absolutely outraged, and there'd be a world war. There'd be, if say, for example, just for sake of argument, just say Sweden was some major power in the world, and they were flying across the sea and droning people in, say, New York City, just going around droning people because they were suspected to be something, suspected, quote unquote, terrorist or whatever. Whatever the hell they make up for their assassination program in the United States government. Just say that was happening and people were being droned, whole buildings were being sort of bombed from the sky to knock off somebody, to kill somebody. Whole apartment blocks and infrastructure, like Saudi Arabia is doing for, in this pretense of trying to get Houthis or whatever, killing, bombing hospitals and ports that deliver food, to 80% of the people in Yemen. Imagine if, they were bombing New York harbor and bombing all the ships in there, Sweden, going across and just bombing infrastructure. Can you imagine it? It's unimaginable, right? Why is it unimaginable? Because it's the West, if we're Westerners? Is that unimaginable? Because that's what we're doing all over the place in the Middle East. And why are we not just insisting and protesting this? It's just outrageous. I think it was Angelina Jolie the other day in Mosul in Iraq, and you look, and she was going around, and there was buildings everywhere, complete rubble, and you could smell. She said you could smell the bodies in the rubble. She works for the United Nations, I think. She does stuff for them. She said you could smell the bodies in the rubble, and people, when she talked to people in Mosul, they were even though it was an awful situation for them, they were so relieved that on Eid, they at least weren't having to deal with, I think it was, they weren't having to deal with what they were having to deal with a year before that, with bombings and stuff. I mean, and I was looking, and these people were walking around in just piles and piles of rubble. And that's what we've done to them. That's just one of many illegal wars. Everything the United States is doing is against international law. None of these countries, like Syria and all these, none of them are any threat to them whatsoever. This is all against international law, and that Iraq war was started on a lie. It was an invented lie, weapons of mass destruction. So, this dreadful carnage and destruction that Western allies are doing, and with oops, I think my online connection's a bit sorry out there for a moment. I mean, I think you get my point. It's basically, why aren't we speaking out about these various things? Why isn't everybody doing sort of writing about it and calling their representatives in government and protesting? This even in a selfish sense, this is coming back to all of us. Everybody should care about this, even in a totally selfish sense. I would hope that people think more about this than just, oh no, some of this is happening to me now. Neoliberalism and austerity is coming my way. The reason austerity is coming our way is because these oligarchs in power don't give a toss about you or I or anybody on this planet, and it doesn't matter if you're white or brown or black or whatever. The US started as a white supremacist society, killing off indigenous people and enslaving black people and bringing them over. Capitalism was built, the US was built on the backs of slaves. And in Australia, we wiped out most of the indigenous people here. It's just sort of like, I don't know, it's a scourge. We can do something, though, right now. We have the power because there's more of us than there are of these oligarchs. And by the way, US empire is now it's falling and it's freaking out. Economically, it's being taken over. It's the power. China is becoming a big economic power. And why not? I mean, the United States sees China as a big threat. The Pentagon even put out a report that they're no longer interested in terrorism. Terrorism was just like a Trojan horse to destroy the Middle East. But they're no longer interested in terrorism, in quotes. They're interested in China and Russia because they pose a threat to their hegemony. They actually came out and pretty much said that. They didn't use the word hegemony, but it's like they see them as a threat because they're an economic threat. And so the United States the United States government and the inverted totalitarian state they have there is freaking out. And they're wanting to end any sort of what they see as a challenge. It's okay for the United States to do this to other countries and to be dictating economic terms to people. But it's not okay if there's anything that is reciprocated. So this is where we're at now. The US empire now is a very dangerous empire because it's basically wants full spectrum dominance by any means necessary. And I mean that, by any means necessary. And it could end up in a big mushroom cloud. I don't know. I don't know how stupid these people are, but they might sort of go, well, if US empire is going to fall, we're going to take everybody else with us. It could be that crazy. But each one of us, like I started this talk, each one of us could do, if we all spoke out. This is the terrible thing. If we all spoke out against these dreadful crimes that are happening, and war is a crime. I don't see individual acts as war crimes. The whole thing is criminal. But if we all spoke out against these dreadful things that are going on and stop voting for these people who support it, including the likes of Bernie Sanders, who has supported so many imperialist bills over the decades, and he's been promoting anti-Russian propaganda, and he's promoted regime change in Syria. He's thrown Palestinians under the bus when he signed that letter with I think it was 100 other senators last year, saying the UN to stop their bias against Israel. But he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. He's okay with the drone program. He said if he was president, he would still continue on the drone program. That's killing women and children. You know, I don't know why people who think of themselves as progressives still support that man. I have no idea. It's sort of disturbing to me. And he's going to lead them up the garden path in 2020. He's saying all the right things that, you know, throwing a little bit of candy to the progressives, you know, talking about how wrong it is, these wars, and throwing some stuff about Palestinians. I'm sorry, it keeps cutting out. I'm sorry for any of you lost me stands, but I'm the artificial wars that are happening, the 8 other wars that the US is leading, and everything, and the ecocide that's happening. There's an ecocide happening, and that's why we should go vegan too, because I mean, I read an incredible. There's a report out recently. I'll leave a link to it. I mean, it's an incredible report. It just shows the devastating effects the meat and dairy industry have on so many things, including fish farming and whatever. That's why, that's one of the most important reasons to be vegan, is because non-human animals are not our resources. They never were. They're sentient beings, and we need to respect them and stop exploiting them for food, clothing, entertainment, and other reasons. But it's also killing the planet. And I'm going to leave a link to that. This report says one of the greatest things, a single greatest things anybody can do to address the anthropogenic climate disruption, climate change, is to go vegan. That's what it says. It's an amazing report. And watch Cowspiracy, the sustainability secret, if you haven't already seen that. And the health benefits of being vegan too are tremendous. So I'm going to leave it here, but I'm sort of finding it very, very disturbing, this lack of the lack of interest in things that happen to brown people and black people. And yet, if this was the same things were happening overseas, happening in the United States, that's happening to people in Palestine or people in Yemen, there'd be outrage all over the world. It just would be unthinkable, and there'd be a world war. So why is that? Is it because we're just big racists, big white supremacist racists, that we just, it's not okay for this to be happening to Western people, but it's okay that we're doing this to brown and black people in Western Asia and elsewhere? You know, really, I have to ask myself that. Are we just big bloody racists that we let this go on? I can't see any other reason why. Or we're either completely ignorant that it's going on, or we have we have otherized people to the point where we don't think they're important as white people, as important as people in the West. And how shocking and sad that would be if that's the case. But I don't understand why people are allowing this to go on. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. So I hope that I hope you'll consider sharing information that I'll leave in the information section about Yemen, and follow people like Abby Martin on Media Roots Radio, and please consider being a patron of their Media Roots Radio. And because they're the US, with their sanctions against Venezuela, are messing with Telesur, which is the news source that is airing Empire Files, and I think it's making it very difficult for the Empire Files to sort of get money for further programs. So this is how the US empire is also censoring information that criticizes their dreadful empire by putting sanctions on Venezuela, which affects Telesur. They've been trying to get rid of Telesur because it, like some programs on RT, exposes the crimes of empire. So anyway, so support Abby Martin and Robbie Martin and the Empire Files and Media Roots Radio. Support journalists like Ben Norton, who works for the Real News Network. There's a bunch of them, and that they give incredible, they do incredible journalism, and they don't make the money that Rachel Maddow makes. You know how much Rachel Maddow makes? $30,000 a day for her propaganda. And interestingly, just recently, I mean, she's been going Russia, Russia, Russia for a year now, and the ratings are skyrocketing. That's another disturbing thing, that people are so sort of, I don't know, stupid, that this is what they think is interesting to tune into, this anti-Russian propaganda. And now she, even though now she's sort of suggesting that Russia is, or Putin is behind this deal with DPRK and Trump, or the thing that's going on with North and South Korea. She's sort of pressing that Putin is behind it. I mean, good Lord, what is wrong with these people? The amount of money they get to put out this propaganda, I mean, obviously that overrides any conscience they have. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here, so thanks very much for watching. Please do what you can to bring an end to this awful genocide in Yemen, and support the Palestinians in any way you can. So thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts, and this is Faint Signals from Vega. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel at Vegantrove, VEGANTROVE on YouTube, and click the little bell for notifications, and then you'll get a notification if I upload a video or if I go live. Okay, thanks.